Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. This is the keynote speech for this conference today on intellectual diversity and the Legal Academy. I'm very grateful to all of you for staying throughout the day and all of the sessions, and I think it's been a very productive conference. Our keynote address will be delivered today by Sherif Girgis. Sherif Girgis is a JD student at Yale Law School and a PhD candidate in philosophy at Princeton University. He received his undergraduate degree summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Princeton University and his B.Phil in moral and legal philosophy from Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He is the primary author of the book, along with his co-author, Professor George, who was on the last panel, What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense. We thought it was entirely appropriate that on this conference on intellectual diversity in the Legal Academy, that the keynote address be delivered by a student at a law school. So without further ado, Sherif Girgis.
Well, great. Thanks a lot, Joel, for the introduction and for the honor of speaking here. I've been lucky to give talks at a couple different law schools, and every time I show up, I can feel the question flash on people's faces, why him? And that might be particularly insistent today because this is a really distinguished conference, and again, I'm really grateful for the introduction. Of course, I have no data to share, no findings to support, and no technical solutions to offer. And unlike the faculty who've spoken, my experience at the Legal Academy hardly spans 2 years. But on the other hand, I've spent those years pushing the most hated conservative position on the most heated political issue at the most socially liberal law schools in the country. So what my experience lacks in length, it has made up, I think, in intensity. The book that Joel referred to is What is Marriage? So it offers a defense of traditional marriage, the idea that marriage is the union of a man and a woman, and the idea that the state has good reasons to enshrine that view and against enshrining the alternative view on offer in the same-sex marriage debate. And it was based off of an article that appeared in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy a couple years before that. So when I refer to the article or the book, that's what I'm talking about. So I do hope that even if my remarks lack the kind of systematicity and probative force of data or findings, that they'll have something of the motivating force of the more personal or anecdotal. And in that mode, I'll be drawing on my experience at Yale and in these talks and debates at other law schools on the book and the article to say a word about each of our topics. Is there a diversity problem? Does it matter? And what should we do about it? I should say at the beginning that the fact is that I've loved my time at Yale and visiting other law schools. So I'm speaking not as an alien or as an exile with kind of idle grievances to air, but as a member of the minority pushing for reform from within with the zeal and the optimism and the hopefulness of a local who intends to stay. The problem that bedevils the social science on this question is well known, and we've talked about it a lot. What are the proxies for ideological diversity? On what axes should we measure it, and so on? Of course, we can't answer these questions, I think, until we know why we care about diversity in the first place. A professor at Yale once told me that she absolutely agreed on the need for conservative faculty. After all, she said, I think without irony, we liberals have trouble getting you guys internships in Republican administrations. And of course, if that's your purpose, then party affiliation is the thing you have to tally. But if your purpose is also to enrich discussions on major issues of the day, then all the law and econ scholars from Coase to Calabrese won't make up for the absence of a single pro-lifer. And I think that is the situation at Yale. We have almost all the law and econ guys from Coase to Calabrese, and we don't have a single pro-lifer that I'm aware of. So there's no all-purpose answer to the question of whether we have a diversity problem or of how to measure it. But if that kind of sociological precision is hard to get, then personal experience matters all the more. And after all, it is a personal impression that's one of the main factors we're after, insofar as it affects classroom atmosphere, and that affects everything that happens pedagogically at a law school. And from that vantage point, I think certain deficits become entirely clear. A few weeks into my 1L fall, I had to miss an afternoon class to drive down to Seton Hall for, I think it was my first marriage debate. The following Monday, a classmate was really sweet, was making small talk with me, and she asked where I had been. So I said, I kind of felt it coming. So I said, a debate. She said, about what? And I said, gay marriage. And she said, and in that kind of, like, we know what the answer is, but I have to ask the question anyway. Well, what side were you on? I kind of bit my lip, and I thought, I can dodge, and I can say, like, well, I was just looking at different. I said, I was against. So she paused. She searched, and she searched. And then her face lit up, and she said, oh, it was one of those debates where you go and they assign you a side. She's, again, really sweet, one of the warmest people I know. She's become a friend. But within weeks of arriving at Yale, she had internalized the prevailing social norm. Like other members of the Guild, I was to be treated as innocent until proven conservative. That was not just a safe assumption, it was the only charitable one. Mark Bauerlein talks about this effect of homogeneity. He calls it the first protocol of academic society, that in professional settings you take for granted that all the strangers are liberals. If we specify this claim to social liberalism or even to secularism, I think it's undeniable. Both are presumed by all. Social conservatives and people who draw on religious traditions in shaping their norms, and that can include believers and non-believers, are radically underrepresented. And these are just two groups of many, but they'll be the focus of my remarks here. And everyone gets that they're underrepresented. My friend JJ, who's here, told me that he was once the lone apologist for the pro-life view in a class discussion that had veered onto Casey or Roe, which at Yale can happen in a class on maritime law. And he said that a few days later, one of his classmates from that discussion kind of found him in the hallway, sort of sidled up to him, and almost whispered, I think I'm pro-life. Again, I think that just clearly indicates these stories are funny, but they're not surprising, and it clearly indicates the deficits we're talking about. So, should we care? Or why should we care? Well, I should begin by echoing a point that Professor Paulson made earlier. I don't think law schools have a general duty to hire conservatives. Liberty Law School, for example, is entitled to focus on evangelical Christian hires. It's entitled to be fundamentalist in the sense of enforcing agreement on fundamentals in order more effectively to develop Christian legal thought, the social teachings of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. By the same token, I think there's no harm in founding a private law school of liberal fundamentalism, dedicated to refining the social gospel of Sanger, Hume, Mill, and Rawls. It would be a way of making distinctive contributions, but it would be an honest way of doing that. And that would avoid the hypocrisy and complacency and delusions of capaciousness that we sometimes see. And it would be aware of the costs of that approach as well, to be balanced against its benefits. I'm going to just mention three of the costs that I've seen. Costs to career development, to knowledge, and to friendship. First, career development. Here I'm thinking mainly of my liberal friends, and by career development I mean their preparedness to fight effectively against my views. Knowing your enemies means knowing their arguments, and for that it's awfully useful to have them around to make those arguments. Otherwise, positions grow soft and dull. This is a point that we've discussed. On my admitted students weekend at Yale, I had been looking forward to meeting a professor who I had hoped would be a mentor. As soon as he recognized me and remembered the article I'd written, he took me aside for some re-education. Did I know, he asked, that I was on the wrong side of history? You heard that phrase before? That I was pushing the modern equivalent of Jim Crow. That if in 20 years I wasn't the smartest person on earth, I'd be out of a job. For perspective, imagine a conservative professor meeting a young pro-choice admit who'd spent summers at Planned Parenthood. Imagine him telling her that future generations would regard her as a murderer, as someone with innocent baby's blood on her hands. Well, when he'd finished his opening spiel, I thought the only respectable and respectful reply would be to return a challenge. So I said, well, Professor, Newsweek says that we have 500,000 polyamorous households. Unlike polygamy, they don't involve gender inequality. Polyamorous say that they find the most personal and sexual fulfillment in the openness and variety of their relationships. They find monogamy heteronormative and unjust. They want equal social status and tax breaks. Is the norm of monogamy also a latter-day form of Jim Crow? Because I was surprised at his response, I recorded it the same day in an email to a friend, which I can now quote. "I haven't thought as deeply about that issue. I just haven't." Now, how is it that a Yale professor who claimed for his own view a monopoly on justice and rationality and employability could be caught off guard by an entirely standard objection? The only explanation, I think, is intellectual homogeneity. And here conservatives have the advantage. To be a conservative at a top law school today is to be silenced or sharpened. There is no middle ground. And with more balance, liberals would also be sharpened, and no one would be silenced. Well, what about the cost to the pursuit of knowledge? We all know the marketplace of ideas argument, so I won't rehearse it here. I just want to supplement it with a few points. One of the unexpected results of engaging on the marriage issue, for me at least, has been to uncover much deeper and often more interesting divides between me and my interlocutors. For example, consider the different ways that both sides of the marriage debate gloss a very common idea, and an idea common to both sides, which is that marriage is the bond that unfolds into family life. Social liberals think that what gives a union this connection to family life is choice and choice alone. There's no other more objective criterion. But if that's the case, one might ask why marriage should have any objective link to sex or romance. If two brothers in a platonic bond commit to sharing a life and a home and even child rearing, why don't they count as also having a union that unfolds into family life? And so the more traditional view will say that marriage relates to family life not by choice, but by its very nature. Just as the act that makes marital love also makes new life, so marriage itself is oriented to procreation and family life. In other words, and this is my point, not to adjudicate that debate, but to point out that liberal individualism would explain that link between marriage and family by autonomous choice. And a more Aristotelian approach links bonds to certain goods by their characteristic activities, which can't be redefined by choice alone. So the idea that marriage and family go together is a statement of apparent consensus that masks a much deeper and more intellectually interesting divide. That explains, I think, why debates like marriage can be so polarizing. Using similar sounding premises, forensically identical premises, people reach radically different conclusions. Each side finds the other baffling, and I think that's why you see the attributions of irrationality or bigotry or ignorance or just bad faith. And this, I think, has been something that the Academy can be a response to. I mean, the Academy, at least ideally, offers the leisure and the resources and the methods to go deeper and to explain and give clarity to what is otherwise a very polarizing debate. And in fact, in academic debates on marriage, my interlocutors and I have, on occasion, managed to trace our dispute to deeper debates between Aristotelian and Kantian or other traditions. And one thing I can tell you, in some cases people have come out closer to my view or even embracing my view, but in many cases they've certainly come out not thinking it was just bigotry. You can't say that the dispute between Aristotle and Kant is a dispute between bigotry and goodwill. And this highlights my broader point. The academic community's pursuit of truth is not served just by having lots of opinions in one room, which is how it's often described. Diverse conclusions are also a good proxy for methodological diversity. Not in the sense of quantitative versus theoretical. I mean what Alasdair MacIntyre would call a diversity of traditions of rationality. Historically situated systems of belief that shape not just our endpoints, but the options we consider in the first place, and even the standards of rational justification that we think are sound. But as in the example I just gave, these systems are systems we rarely realize that we inhabit until we've been alienated from them in order to recognize them as something other than just a part of the natural fabric of the universe, which is, I think, how a lot of people who are politically liberal in the narrow sense reach their conclusions, which is by thinking that liberal individualism is just the default rational position. And for that healthy alienation from a view that you might not even know you inhabit, there really is no good substitute to a real-life opponent. Note that some of these intellectual traditions, by the way, have been developed for centuries in religious contexts. I think it would be just as dogmatic to exclude them for that reason as it would be to include them only because of their claim of a divine sanction. That's why I think a diverse faculty will have thinkers open to drawing on religious sources for their normative visions. So though my work on marriage has offered secular arguments with roots in ancient Greek philosophy, these roots have been developed by great Jewish, Catholic, and Muslim figures. So even in classes I've attended, and much more often in classes I've only been told about after the fact, they have been attributed, because of that, by my name, to religious bigotry or associated with arguments for slavery. The combination of ignorance and bravado that produces such comments is toxic to academic life, and against it, some religiously informed scholarship would be the best solvent. All right, well, if intellectual diversity in the academy can help us clarify and diagnose what are, outside the academy, deeply polarizing debates, then it can also contribute to civic friendship. Grutter speaks of law school's social responsibility to prepare students to work in a diverse populace. But by that rationale, these institutions should both model and foster civil conversations on heated issues for the wider world. If not here, then where? And I think these two controlling values together, knowledge and civic friendship, will limit the scope of intellectual diversity that we're aiming for. It'll give us a more manageable goal. It obviates some of the objections that we've been talking about, that, well, if you're going to challenge our most basic conclusions, then why won't we have to hire clever advocates of cannibalism or something like that? Because even if you see cannibalism and traditional marriage as equally gross deviations from truth and justice in the American way, the communal value of understanding what half your compatriots think will break the tie in favor of the traditional marriage advocate. But I think, finally, that intellectual diversity can serve friendship in a thicker sense. And this is a kind of unusual point to make in this debate, but I think it's important. When I first arrived at Oxford, the only people I knew were American Rhodes Scholars. And so, following a venerable Rhodes tradition, I spent all my time with them. By word of mouth, everybody had figured out that I was also a conservative Catholic. And of course, they found this baffling. What surprised me was how much of an obstacle it proved to be. Over and over, I'd find myself minutes into that first banal conversation with someone asking how many siblings and pets they have. And a classmate would interrupt and just ask whether I really believe that stuff about abortion and marriage, but especially marriage. In fact, there was no avoiding that conversation, the conversation. So I decided to just invite it aggressively for a whole month with whomever. Anytime they got a twinkle in their eye, I'd just say, abortion? And they'd nod, and we'd talk about it. And I figured if anyone stuck around after that, we'd move on to what seemed to me then to be the separate work of becoming friends. It took only about 3 weeks for me to get through all but 2 of my 31 classmates. And those conversations taught me 2 things. First, for that group, my social views were so baffling that the conversation was indeed a condition of any friendship at all. But second, the same conversation, however heated, was also a way of building up that friendship, and a friendship of a particularly rich kind that I discovered first in its fullness, I think, when I was there. The kind of friendship that builds up amid and through, and not despite, deep disagreements, if you're both after the truth. In other words, the ones with whom I had had the most intense conversations were the ones who were, by and large, likeliest to stick around. Law schools, like other academic institutions, aim to be more than a transient assemblage of instructors and instructed. The goal is academic community, a network of goodwill, equal regard, and common purpose. Now, it's inevitable that there will be conservatives or people of faith, at least among the students. But if they're on the faculty as well, then students won't have to spend a month explaining themselves on pain of exclusion from that academic community. A diverse faculty would guarantee that every new class arrived in mid-conversation, so to speak. Because I didn't want to repeat those first conversations from then till I had tenure, hopefully, I thought I would write them out, and especially on the marriage issue in particular. So in those first months at Oxford, I'd walk down Hollywell Street from a particularly heated debate at the King's Arms down to my apartment and start writing what became, eventually, when we got around to it, the seeds of the marriage article, which of course became the book. And it was during that process that I saw how friendship isn't just the result of vigorous disagreement in pursuit of the truth, it can also promote truth-seeking. With each sentence I wrote, and this is not an exaggeration, though it makes me sound insane, I would hear some of my Oxford friends' voices in my head, hemming and hawing and making sharp rebuttals. It made it a very slow writing process, as Robbie George will tell you, but it was, I think, a fruitful one. And over my time there, I even found myself writing for those friends. Not just in the original sense that I wanted to answer their questions, but in the broader and more familiar sense in which friendship, which is built up by sharing, motivates you to produce something worth sharing. In fact, in drafting the article in particular, I kept two people in mind the whole time. One was my father, and the other was a close and much smarter Oxford friend. I wanted my engineer dad to be able to get through the whole thing. That was the only goal. And I wanted my friend, my polar opposite in all things political, to see where I was coming from, to see interesting and deep issues where until then he had only seen an obvious conclusion. I've never actually had the courage to ask my dad if he's read it, but on more than one occasion, my friend, whose promising career I won't risk by naming him, has summarized its arguments more elegantly than I and defended its value for the debate despite his strong disagreements. I think that experience would be multiplied with greater intellectual diversity. All right, so if career development and knowledge and civic and personal friendship give us reasons to promote diversity, what should we do about it? We've already talked about the huge costs, collateral costs and others, that come with quotas or supervision of academic hiring or any other structural solution. And anyway, structure always runs out at some point. Where it does, I think nothing will substitute for the exercise of virtues on the part of those applying and those hiring. Both need a measure of charity and of daring. Of course, if I'm right that even our standards of rational justification are shaped by the traditions that we inhabit, there's a problem, and it's a problem we've talked about today. There's no neutral ground from which to judge the basic admissibility of a viewpoint. But you need no neutral ground to ask some of the relevant questions. For example, how strongly does someone's work challenge my own deepest assumptions? I think hiring committees who never ask that question aren't doing their part. But to notice that work might challenge them at all, scholars need to be aware of it. That's especially true and for that they need to seek it out if the forums for such exchange, journals and conferences and symposia, themselves suffer from similar diversity problems. I began my talk on an optimistic note because even at a conservative desert like Yale, I've seen people exemplify this sort of energetic interest in reading and knowing the opposition. Last spring, I took anti-discrimination law with Reva Siegel. As far as I could tell, I was the only conservative in the room. She could have run the whole thing like an ACLU strategies meeting. So when I found her assigning conservative articles and pausing the class's leftward rush with good objections, I thought she was only trying to make things less awkward for me. Then one day I asked a question about an issue related to marriage, and she referred me to a piece by Robbie George and some co-author she didn't know, who were replying to Kenji Yoshino. And that's when I knew that she wasn't just accommodating me, for I was that co-author. It turns out that she had just developed the habit of reading and even recommending the opposition. Likewise, Professor Akhil Amar, while making no secret of his more liberal views, often highlights his dissent with energy his dissent from the liberal line, or the stereotypically liberal line, on things like Lopez and guns' rights, or on the reasoning of Griswold or Roe. And to keep his co-partisans thinking critically, he often reminds them of progressive heroes' historical blind spots, like, with apologies to Harvard, Justice Holmes' chilling, but then very typical embrace of eugenics. These habits and practices on the part of liberal faculty already improve the conversation. They already contribute to some of the goods we're talking about. They also make it likelier that a conservative might find a faculty home at Yale one day or gain the education and support at Yale to teach elsewhere. But if those hiring have to be daring and energetic in seeking out aspiring conservative academics, we, for our part, have to take the risk of making our arguments right when that might break our careers. And I take it that this is the point that Professor Paulson was reaching. We won't get hired without, as he said earlier, challenging the lines of reasonability that liberals have drawn. Because, again, we can't avoid drawing those lines at all. In fact, at the very least, there are some substantive beliefs that you have to contribute to a healthy academic community. Commitment to truth, openness to correction, and goodwill and equal regard for your colleagues as rational. And of course, this is the conundrum. This is the difficulty, that these are precisely the virtues and dispositions that we tend to think our opponents lack when it comes to the most polarizing debates. Yet it's in those same debates that we could most use the Academy's potentially clarifying influence. Today, the issue that best exemplifies this conundrum, the issue on which it's most important to hire the very people whose commitment to rationality and equality you're most likely to suspect, is, I think, the marriage debate. And that ultimately has been one motive for me to dive into the debate at this stage with all its toxicity, to convince some on the other side that their assumptions are unexamined and even unacknowledged, that their opponents are committed to justice and draw on traditions which there are intellectual costs to ignoring. In other words, I've intended this work, among other things, as a tiny push for intellectual diversity, as a contribution, however modest, to my would-be colleagues' career development, to better inquiry and civility, and, dare I hope, to friendship. Thanks. Okay. Take a few questions before we get to drinks.
You mentioned how while you were at Oxford, you had to go through this month where you were engaging and that sort of thing, not that sort of thing, and to get past that barrier and then build that respect that resulted. And then it was proposed that if some diversity on the faculty at law schools would start that conversation further along the way. And I want to question the idea that maybe especially incoming students would, because of some portion of conservative professors, automatically have that respect for.
That's a great question. So is it really going to make a difference if there are some conservative faculty there? I mean, especially for incoming students. I think my, unfortunately, personal narrative experience that it does make a very big difference is my undergraduate experience at Princeton. There are some outspoken conservative faculty at Princeton, including on social issues. And the first thing I noticed, I have no reason to think that many of them knew about Robbie George or some of the others before getting there. But even among the people he never taught, the conversation was different because he was there. And in some ways, it's just really basic. It doesn't take long before after getting there, to find out that the McCormick professor of jurisprudence thinks that gay marriage is a non sequitur, is a bad idea. And that already provides a kind of intellectual respectability. There's also the practical stuff, that every time they have a liberal panel or a panel on an issue on which there would be normally a liberal dominance, they wheel out Robbie George, and he gives his view. He's not the only one that's there. There are probably about a dozen or close to 24 now faculty who identify as conservative on the kinds of issues I'm talking about. So in general, the point is that the intellectual climate, the news about it spreads very fast, and it changes the shape of the conversations, even of people who don't have direct experience with the work, but it obviously makes it much more likely that they'll also encounter that work. And so even if there's a week of lag time, it makes a huge difference. Yes?
I meant a bigger question, and I mean it really sincerely. You talk about accepting another person's view and even being friendly with that person. But let's say the view is something like a Nazi view, or let's say the view is a strong eugenics view.
Right.
That's, to some degree, abortion is kind of, can you be friendly with someone who, let's say, advocates genocide?
Right, so a couple things. By accept, I didn't mean accept the view. So it's not about making sure that there's more agreement. In fact, it's the opposite. And I accept your premise that there will be, or I accept the premise sort of the question, that there will be some views that should disqualify a person from academic community. Not because it's a view that you disagree with or because of the strength of the disagreement, but because there are substantive requirements. There are substantive beliefs and commitments you have to make the common project of academic community happen. And those include things like a basic regard for the equality of your colleagues, their rationality, and and some kind of goodwill on your part and an interest in actually seeking the truth and not speechifying. That's part of what I was saying makes this particular debate so difficult. There is no formal way of counting one or another side in or out. You just have to have the merits argument. Because if, in fact, it were reasonable to conclude that the traditional view on this issue means that you're not committed to the things you need to be committed to make university life work, then that would be a very good reason for exclusion. And I think they just happen to be wrong about that substantive question. But I can convince them of that without convincing them of opposing gay marriage. Because I can show them that what they're missing, all the stuff about traditions, that the reason they think it's this clear, closed question is that they're occupying a tradition that they don't even realize they're occupying, that they're already granting assumptions that are just assumptions and contingent and historically situated, and so on. So there will be some debates where you don't even have to have that kind of discussion to see that someone could be reasonable and disagree. There are some where you do. And when you do, there's no formal or structural way of settling the question. You just have to have the argument, and that's going to require risk-taking on the part of one side and a certain kind of charity and openness on the part of the other. I wish there were a formal way of getting out of it, but I don't think there is. Okay, thanks very much.